Good morning. It's 10 a.m. on Sunday, March 20th, and I'm where I'm supposed to be, but you're not. Because, of course, we have suspended worship services through the month of March. But I don't want the congregation to be left without some measure of spiritual encouragement during this time, so I'll be recording the sermons of our Lenten series and making them available on our website. Many thanks to Karen Ward and Bob Howard for their technical assistance to make this possible. Even though we will not have the music and the children and the rich fellowship of being together, I hope you'll find these recorded messages helpful. Videotaping the sermon is with some limitations. For one thing, with our equipment, we can get a better quality recording if I don't move around. And of course, that cramps my style. Moving back and forth across the chancel helps me feel engaged or more engaged with the congregation. So we may lose some of the life of the sermon, but the content will be here, and I will offer what I have as best as I can, even if I have to be still. I preach from a sitting position after the example of Jesus. My hope is that this more conversational approach will be a better way when we're doing a recording. In our Lenten series, in our journey to Easter, we're looking at some of the significant events in the life of Jesus that either directly or indirectly point to the last week of his life, his suffering and his death, and eventually the culmination of the story on Easter Sunday. Today we have a familiar story from the Gospel of John. I'm reading John 4, verses 3 through 29. He, Jesus, left Judea and started back to Galilee. But he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask me for a drink, a woman of Samaria?" And in parentheses it says, "Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying this to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons, his flocks, drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But anyone who drinks the water that I give will no longer thirst. The water that I give will become to them a spring of water, gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have is not your husband." "What you have said is true," the woman said to him. "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. As I stop at this point to encourage you not to get lost in the reading, because it goes through a lot of detail. But I continue now. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, Messiah who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. Jesus said to her, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. Just then, his disciples came. They were astonished that he was speaking with the woman, but no one said, what do you want, or why are you speaking with her? Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. She said to the people, come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this good day. Help us do good with it. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. When I was a boy, growing up in North Carolina, public water fountains were segregated. There were fountains for whites and a separate fountain for coloreds. When I was 17, a senior in high school, I gave a sermon on Youth Sunday at the Presbyterian Church, of course. To begin that sermon, I said, I wanted to talk about the sin of racism. Immediately, several people got up and walked out of church. When I asked our pastor what I had done wrong, he said, you crossed the line. At Sycamore, on his way to Easter, Jesus crossed the line. The story of the woman at the well is a familiar one to most churchgoers. The setting is an old landmark known as Jacob's Well. Here, weary travelers would stop for water and rest. Jesus and his disciples stop there, and the disciples go grocery shopping. While Jesus is resting by the well, he encounters a woman of Samaria. The conversation that ensues will have far-reaching impact on the life and ministry of Jesus. For most people who are familiar with this story, the most remembered part of the story is that about the husband. Jesus asks the woman about her husband, knowing that she had had 5 husbands and that she is currently living with a 6th man without the benefit of marriage. Here's the interesting thing. The part we most remember has nothing to do with the point of the story. We could omit those verses about the husband, and nothing of significance of this encounter is lost. Jesus says nothing about marriage or divorce or living with someone who is not your spouse or husband or wife. So if we don't get distracted by the husband and the material around the husband, we have a rather succinct story of a conversation Jesus has with this Samaritan woman. Here's how the story flows. Jesus asks for a drink of water. The woman is surprised that Jesus would ask her for water. They talk about living water, the living water that Jesus offers. They discuss the right way to worship. Jesus identifies himself as the Messiah. The disciples return from their trip into town, and they're astonished that Jesus is talking with a woman. The woman returns to her village, wondering if this man could really be the Messiah. Now, every point of the story points back to the exchange at the beginning. The woman asked Jesus, "How is it that you, a Jew, would ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" If you had been there, if you had been a church-going Jew at Jesus' time, you would have been shocked beyond sensibility. A Jewish man in the first century would never have a public conversation with a woman. It just wasn't done. So Jesus crosses the line. He could not have made a more socially unacceptable blunder. With this conversation, Jesus initiated a public scandal that would have not only been unethical, it could also have been dangerous. The woman knew immediately what Jesus had done. "How is it that you, a Jew, would ask a drink of me?" Clearly, she is alarmed. She is confused. How could this be? But more importantly, she is probably also very frightened. You can almost see her looking around to see if anyone else heard it. This was a violation of the rules of public discourse. And guess who gets stoned if this scandal is witnessed? Not the Jewish man who initiated the conversation, but the woman who participated in it. But Jesus doesn't just cross one line, he crosses another. A Jewish man would never have a public conversation with a Samaritan. It just wasn't done. In fact, Jews would have nothing to do with Samaritans. The animosity of Jews towards Samaritans was an all-encompassing, in-your-face, 100-year-old vendetta. Perhaps you remember the history. When Babylonia conquered the nation of Israel, half the people were carried off into exile, and the other half of the people were left behind and ruled by Babylonian vassals. Then about 100 years later, before the time of Jesus, about 50 years later, 100 years before the time of Jesus, the exiled Jews were allowed to return home. And when they got back home, when these faithful Jews returned to Jerusalem to refurbish their faith and rebuild the temple, they discovered that the Jews who had been left behind had intermarried with other people in the area. This was an offense to Jewish nationalism and an abomination to the Jewish faith. It was inexcusable, unforgivable, and unforgettable. We know from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that the Jewish leaders, when they returned, tried to annul all the marriages that had taken place with folks in the region. And we know from these same accounts that the children of these marriages were cast out of the village. It is the descendants of these impure Jews that were the Samaritans. And throughout the New Testament, we see the disdain of these Samaritans by Orthodox Jews. Because of a mishap of history, the Samaritans were outcasts, persona non grata in the Jewish community. Jesus ignored conventional propriety. He not only talked to this Samaritan, he asked her for help. He asked for a drink of water. I mentioned the parenthetical comment following verse 9. Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Most biblical scholars believe that this parenthetical insertion here is a note that recognizes that the Samaritan woman hesitating to give Jesus a drink meant that she would have to offer him a drink from a common water dipper, thus sharing the water dipper she used with Jesus. Our segregated water fountains in the 50s and 60s, the fountains marked whites and colored, would be a direct parallel. Now, A Jew would never have a public conversation with a woman, period. And a Jew would never have a public conversation with a Samaritan, male or female. But if one did somehow sneak up, away, or out from the public eye and had a conversation with a Samaritan, if you were so brazen, if you were willing to break all the rules of social, religious, and political discourse and enter into such a conversation, you certainly would not talk about theology. You wouldn't talk about religion. You wouldn't talk about church. You might talk about the weather, your grandchildren, but you wouldn't dare discuss the law and the prophets. You wouldn't talk with this Samaritan about the proper way to worship or the identity of the Messiah. Yet that is what Jesus did. Here Jesus crosses a third line. Not only does he ignore the constraints of social interaction, he draws this Samaritan woman into a conversation that would have been expressly limited to the highest educated Jewish men in the synagogue. But there is more. Not only does Jesus discuss theology with this outcast, he offers her the living water. He includes her in the offer of salvation. He offers her what had, for 1,000 years or more, been reserved for Orthodox Jews. Everyone who heard this conversation, including the disciples, would have been whispering, heresy. Heresy, you remember, is another offense, so damning that it would lead to stoning. So when Jesus stopped at Sychar on his way to Easter, we began to see why he would become so unpopular. He simply had no respect for the restraints of modern society. He was breaking long-established rules. He was being heretical in his teaching. Next week, we'll see how this conflict escalates. And later, in Jerusalem, this animosity would contribute to the trial, conviction, and crucifixion of Jesus. But there's more here than a history lesson. Let us be reminded that we must read the Bible with this question in mind. What does this story say to me? What is the message for us today? Let us be reminded, we too have rules of engagement. Oh, they're not as widely spread or as commonly known or written down anywhere, but we have our rules of engagement. We have our social prejudices. We have our fixed traditions and beliefs. And I suspect that Jesus would encourage us to bend the rules a bit, to go beyond conventional norms, and to sit down with one of today's outcasts. Maybe even ask her or him for a cup of water. Maybe even be willing to share the same cup. Someone we would never be seen with. Someone with whom we would risk a public scandal. I think the message for today is simply this. We should be very careful when we draw lines of distinction between us and others. Because Jesus had this habit of crossing the line. Thanks for listening.